the key thing here is to think about a football team. I'll show you why. For example, with something like XP in the blue circle and Scrum, DSDM, Kanban in the red circle, you can pretty much collapse them. And what they look at are things like technical and team practices, and then there are ones that look at project and team practices. So one way to think about them is really as individual football teams. So Manchester United, Newcastle, Liverpool. So all of these names in the blue and red circles are like individual football teams. And what happens to these individual football teams? They compete with each other. So if you look on the internet, they'll often be, oh, Kanban's so much sexier than XP. XP is so last season, you know? And the key thing to think about Agile is that take it a level up. Look at the black circle, Agile. Yeah? So Agile is football. It's not just a football team, it's football. And if you enjoy football, then you're welcome to come along and play. But let's take that another way of abstracting it up one level, which is lean, because that's where Agile comes from. Yeah? So if you think about Agile as football, then lean can be sport. And if you're into getting healthy and fit, then you're invited too. And what we're finding in organizations is that typically, because of the background of Agile, so you remember the snow-peaked mountains of Snowbird, Utah, Agile typically, because of its background, means that IT tends to introduce Agile into an organization. But it doesn't mean it's the only place you can use it. And likewise, we've got the business, and the business tends to initiate, you know, lean thinking into an organization, and they usher it in. And the good news is, for the first time in history that I can remember, really what you find is that the business and IT all of a sudden have this kind of synchronicity and a framework that they can work together, right? If you look at lean, eliminate waste, deliver value, respect for people. Those aren't original, right? A lot of them come from lean. And that's where the commonality is. And it goes back to much of what David was saying. It's looking about commonalities, synchronicity, and getting everyone to, you know, work together. And that's a very significant moment here. And that's why I wrote down magic happens here. There is no more divide. It's about collaborating and using the tools and skills we have to work together to deliver more value. So let's have a look at Agile in action. So first of all, we have a project, typical. You have 1 to many weeks. In most projects, though, if you're not using Agile, then it's more likely to be months or even years, and others decades. But here we have an Agile project structure, so 1 to many weeks. Then we have releases, and again, they could be 1 to 12 weeks. So projects are made up of releases, so nothing new there. But we're going to split it up a little bit more. And we make something called iterations. So iterations are time boxes. Yeah, spans of time during which we're going to try to create something, develop something that will provide value when we release it. And typically, iterations are between 1 to 4 weeks long. Now, when we work with teams, the first thing I say is, I suggest that you work with 2-week iterations. And there will be kind of uncomfortable shuffling. People go, really? 2-week iterations? Couldn't we have 3? And I would say, well, I would recommend 2. Why do you think I recommend 2? Any suggestions? Yeah, feedback loops. Do you want to elaborate?
The frequent feedback loops, which helps improve the processes.
Yeah, so the shorter the iteration, yeah, the quicker we get feedback, yes? Yeah. So when we first start off the journey, the team has 2 weeks to do something. Now, after the first iteration, shock horror, it didn't go as well as we thought it would. We looked at the elephant, we eyed it up, we were rather hungry, and we decided to go for the whole elephant. We didn't just, you know, nibble at its side. We just had the whole elephant, and now we're stuck after 2 weeks. So then they come back to me and say, Portia, this 2-week thing, Agile, not sure it's going to work. You know, 2 weeks, we think we need longer, but we told you so. At which point, I will give them 2 options. Option 1, stick to the 2-week iteration, and let's practice and get good at it. Option 2, reduce to 1 week iterations. Why do I suggest that? Yeah. Yeah. So we tried to get some focus with 2-week iterations. Wasn't quite enough because we weren't delivering what we needed still. So we reduce it even more. Yeah. So that we can increase focus and get the feedback cycle more. And that's what you see. So over time, you're more likely to see progress because if you're going to fail to deliver a particular iteration, you know much earlier on. And if you know much earlier on, that gives you more options. Well, what do we want to do next here? Or, oh no, that dev environment, it's never worked. It's not the fault of Agile that it surfaced this problem. The problem has always been here. Maybe we need to do something about it now. And it gives everyone the impetus, hopefully, to do something, because if we unblock these so-called impediments or difficulties, then maybe we can get value out of the door. So another term you're going to come across in Agile is something called a user story, which we've looked at briefly, and it's basically a requirement. So here's an example of a user story. You have a title, and you have a role, so as a presenter, as a gold customer. I need a certain capability so that I can achieve a certain goal. The key thing to note here with user stories, which are different from some of the more classic approaches to user stories, to requirements, is that they are very goal and value focused. Again, if you don't know the goal, how do you know where you're going to go? And secondly, we have acceptance criteria. And there are three formats that we kind of use. The first one is binary question, yes or no. So you see that they actually have checkboxes. So what we have is we write down a question. So as a customer, I need this so that I can go on holiday, for example, and it's a holiday shopping website. So binary question from the customer's point of view is, do I receive a confirmation after I've made a booking? Yeah? So it's either yes or no. So at the point after a 2-week iteration and you've committed to delivering that story as a team, the customer of the team, the internal customer, will say, okay, well, let's see if we can tick off that story. And if they go through the process, the demo, and they find they cannot do that because they don't receive confirmation, then it's no. The story is not done. Very nice and clear. And other formats include just making it a statement rather than a question, as well as another approach called given, when, then, which is, given a scenario, when a certain process step happens, then you have an expected outcome. So there are different ways of looking at a user story. The key things to focus is the so that, which is the goal. And you also notice a box here in the left, very modest and discreet, called BV, business value. Okay? We're not going to have enough time to talk about it today because we only have 40 minutes. But business value is something we look at, and initially we use relative estimation to look at, well, is this story going to deliver more value than this one? And there are different techniques you can use in doing that. And of course, there is effort, right? The good old dev estimates or the test estimates that go into that. Yeah? So you've got clearly the value of the story as well as the cost of the story. Yeah? And that's associated with requirements. So as teams deliver this stuff, they can really feel a sense of pride and buzz as they realize that they're really picking up this value as they go along. And when we release it, that's what we can bank for organization. So back to the example of the as-a, I need, so that, clear acceptance criteria. So this is something you can use right away, right? And for those of you who have children, they'll love that. It's a lot of fun. They know exactly what it is you need from them. You know what they need from you, and it's very easy to tick off. You can use this to prepare meetings. So typically when I coach teams, we don't need to do Agile in the large. I can speak to a project manager and say, okay, well, you're going to run this meeting tomorrow. How do you want to run it? And she'll say, oh, well, I fixed this agenda, I've booked the room, no one else is going to be able to talk because I'm running it and we're going to finish it in 30 minutes, And you can see the most normal, nice people who kind of just go a little bit, serious. So I say to them, well, what we could do is we could be a little bit more goal-focused, a bit more value-driven. Let's try to look at the goal and how we're going to achieve that with some acceptance criteria. And we start using this to run meetings. And they love it. They use the bell, they use a timer, and it's all time-boxed. And people still get to say what they need, but they increase the focus. So another term you can come across in terms of user stories is the idea of epic. So epic is really just a very large user story. Now the problem with user stories that are very large is when you put them in something called a project backlog, which is a collection of requirements in your project, is that you tend to get a little bit of indigestion as a team because there's one story that's kind of a nice sized chunk, and they've got a really big one, and they've got a really small one. And that change creates a lot of oscillation and noise in terms of getting flow through your process of delivering value. So what you really want to do is make stories even-sized, nice bite-sized chunks, and it makes it very easy then to predict and estimate how many of these stories a team can deliver over time. And of course, you actually have user stories at different levels. So as you get more sophisticated in the way you think about Agile user stories, you don't have to just think about them at an iteration level, right? That's what the little blue mark there is, represents a story. You can think about stories at a release level. So a release level story can be broken down into an iteration level story, and all the value adds up over time. And likewise, you can write project level stories. Yep. So at Emergent, what we do is we have something called customer value analysis, which I can tell you more about at a later date. And it allows us to actually tap into the value and look at different ways of slicing this, so we can maximize the value at any point in time that you need, in a frequency that you need when we release. And then there's another term called themes. So essentially, they're kind of like story groupings. You take some stories that have very common themes, plain old English themes, the term, and you group them up, and you say, well, maybe that's another way of doing a release. And you also come across a term called definition of done, which is made up of acceptance criteria on the back of the story, nice and handy. But also it can be made up of acceptance tests that typically you would always do. Remember, quality is not negotiable. So the key thing here is once I got myself into trouble, if you like. I always do that. So I seem so controversial when I ask, oh, what is the goal of your project? What is the value of your project? What are the acceptance criteria? But I say to them, quality is not negotiable. And so at that point, the business member got very red in the face, and they say, well, then that means we can't talk about it. And I said, well, no, I didn't say it was not discussable. Just said it's something we strive for. You know, if we assume that it's negotiable and therefore, you know what, it doesn't really matter, then we're really postponing the debt that we're going to have to pay in the future anyway. And let's talk about that if you're prepared to take on the debt. So the key thing to remember is that if you're doing Agile well, then you will ship quality deliverables. If you're not, then you need to question the kind of Agile you're doing and possibly ask for help. So let's see some collaboration in action and how some of the activities in Agile hang together. So typically you'll hear this referred to as a heartbeat, nice and organic and peoply. So typically we have a 2-week iteration. And at the end of an iteration, you don't have to release, right? You can have multiple iterations, 2 or 3 or 4, and then you can choose to release at the end. So you begin with planning, pretty sensible stuff, right? You plan for the iteration and you do release planning. And then at the end of the 2-week iteration, you do show and tells where you actually demo to your internal customer what you've delivered as a team. And you also do something called a retrospective, where you ask yourselves, well, what went well, what went wrong, lessons learned, puzzles, and you come up with actions that you can improve over time, and you plan for those, and they go into the next iteration. And of course, throughout the sprint, what you're looking to do is you'll get progress updates. How do you do that? Well, you use something called a daily stand-up. So when you see people stood up around a room, around a board possibly, what they'll be doing is 15 minutes stood up and answering, what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? And what are my blockers or impediments? And together as a team, they resolve those. Yeah, 15 minutes. And I always say no leaning, no sitting unless you're pregnant or sick or really feeling unwell. Why do we keep it to 15 minutes?
So that it doesn't get into large discussion and we just focus on it.
Yeah, about focus again, right? Time boxing, focus, keep it short. And of course, the team can talk to each other throughout the 2 weeks, right? It's not just the 15 minutes in the morning. It's a nice and focused way of getting progress. And there's also something called Scrum of Scrums, where the team leads of each team as well, they get together for 15 minutes, either daily or twice a week, however you feel the frequency is relevant. And they answer the questions of, what has my team done today? Sorry, what has my team done yesterday? What are they going to do today? And any blockers. And then they can help unblock each other as well.